So we're going to have two presentations in this session, and I will be doing one of them, and then Antoine Lutz will do one, and then hopefully we'll have a little extra time for conversation, and also manage maybe to not go beyond 4:30. Because we may have this session may end up being a bit shorter, but that's okay. We'll see how it goes, see what the energy's like. So I'm not going to introduce myself. You can see that's me, yeah, John Dunn. So I will say that I am kind of split in different areas, and one of the things I'm especially working on these days is on psychoactive substances, which is really kind of what you say in a purple state when you're working on psychedelics. So that is something of interest that may come up even in this context. So I'm going to talk about Lama Willa kind of referred to some of this. I'm going to backtrack into some more theoretical aspects of non-dual awareness. And for some of you, this will be a real review. But I'm also going to be doing this it's somewhat historically, in the sense that I'm going to be focusing on the influence of a particular kind of model coming out of Dharmakirti, which ends up, as we know, because of its citation both by his name actually in some later texts, ends up being very influential for the emergence of a style of practice that eventually comes to be called Mahāmudrā. And maybe we'll dabble a little bit in one of those practices that will actually in many ways be similar to what we did before. So this should hopefully be a review for many people. Just wanted to remind us, right, what the sort of kind of sociological context of these practices are. These are, of course, the Noble's Truths. And in particular, the idea here is that we can eliminate suffering by eliminating its origin. This is going to be across the board for traditions in India. And of course, for the traditions we're talking about, the sort of Dharmakirtian tradition, the source of suffering is ignorance. What does it mean to eliminate ignorance? Again, across the board, eliminating ignorance is done by seeing things truly, so to speak, yatha bhuta darshana. And this leads one to the correct view, samyak drishti, about the nature of reality. So that's a context, and you'll see why that's important, because basically there's going to be a particular account of what it means to see the nature of reality according to this Dharmakirtian model. So let's talk briefly about what the model is. And here we're going to use a model of sense perception, but I just want to invite you to also sort of embrace the mental sense. That is to say, there is a sixth sense. So this works more or less mutatis mutandis, not just for the five external senses, but also for mental contents as well. So what we have here is a stimulus of some kind, and that stimulus has an interaction with a sense faculty represented by that eye. And what that does is it then creates an image in consciousness, according to this model. And that image in consciousness is called the phenomenal form of the object, or the grahya akara. And there is also an image of a sense of subjectivity, the grahaka akara, that emerges. And what's important about these to know is that both of these phenomenal forms, as a translation that George Dreyfus helped me to come up with many years ago, both of these phenomenal forms arise simultaneously, and they are also momentary. So that means that you can't have a phenomenal form of an object you can't have this kind of phenomenal representation, if you're willing to hear that word, of an object without also a sense of subjectivity being produced. But they are momentary. They're changing each moment, just like that Abhidharma model we heard previously. They're also ontologically identical to consciousness itself. So they're not different things in consciousness. They're, in a sense, consciousness appearing phenomenally in a particular way. But the ontology here would be that to the extent that anything exists, there's just this moment of consciousness. It's not actually broken into two ontologically. That's only phenomenally that it is broken in terms of the way it appears. So there are going to be certain sequelae. I think maybe some of you can already guess what they are in terms what this implies about that sense of subjectivity, but we're going to come back to that later. In the meantime, there's something that's really important, one of the sequelae, which is that, of course, this is all we have direct access to. We only have direct access to what is being presented phenomenally in consciousness. So just to take an example, you can have a look at the blue dot. And, we can even do kind of, if I do this in class with my undergraduates, so, not that you guys are undergrads, but, if I say point to the color, or if I say, where's the color? They say, oh, it's over there. First they kind of shake their heads, so bored of Professor Dunn's stupid questions, but it's like, that's what I mean. What's wrong with him today? The color, it's over there, right? But of course, even like a kind of high school physics version of this is that there is no color over there. There's light reflecting at certain frequencies, and or photons, if you like, reflecting at certain frequencies that are interacting with your visual system in such a way that eventually, in some mysterious fashion that nobody seems to be able to quite explain, it goes into eventually into the back of the brain and somehow moves forward in the ventral stream, and eventually we see blue, right? I'm looking at Ken Pollack, because all neuroscientists can explain how we go from that stimulus to the actual experience. Not, I think. But it's a toughie, that so-called hard problem. But what we do know in any case on that model is that there's no blue outside of your mind. Even on this kind of contemporary model, there may be stuff outside of your mind of some kind, and that extra mental stuff has certain kinds of properties that when it interacts with your visual system, you see blue, but the blue you're seeing is inside your mind, right? So that's what this system is saying. The only thing you have direct access, everything you're seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting, all of that is within the field of consciousness. So even if there is stuff outside that's causing that, all you have direct access to is what's within the field of consciousness. So if you're going to answer the question, remember this very important question, what's the nature of reality? That means that even if we admit there's stuff outside, it certainly becomes very important to ask, what's the nature of this, right? What's going on here? Because that's all we have direct access to. If we don't understand the nature of that, then even if there is stuff outside, we're clearly going to have some problems, because we need to understand how that translation process is working, so to speak. That translation process is working so that we go to some kind of stimulus into this experience. So we need to understand the nature of experience. That is the key question. What is the nature of experience? And I think that applies whether or not you have an ontology that accepts extra mental stuff. But then, of course, we can ask, is all this kind of stuff the stuff that constitutes... So one way you can say this, by the way, is you have, let's say, extra mental stuff. What's the color made out of when you're seeing the color? I'm curious if anyone wants to suggest, what's the blue made out of as you're looking at it? No, I'm not asking about the cause of the blue. I'm saying you're seeing blue. What's the blue made out of? No, but I mean, like that stuff, it's made out of some kind of stuff, right? I'm not sure if it's name. I don't see a name. So one way to think about this is that what the stuff is made out of, what you're seeing, is mental stuff, is mind stuff, right? Like the actual content, again, if we go back to here, what you have direct access to is mind stuff. Now that mind stuff may be caused by some non-mind stuff. And the question is the stuff that's causing what you're actually seeing right now, is that stuff outside your mind or not? Let me put it a different way, because it can be different than your own personal mind. Is it the same kind of stuff that constitutes the color that you actually see? Because remember, the color is not out in the world. The color is in your consciousness. The causes of color are out in the world. If you were a bird, you'd see different things. Birds have a much more finely grained visual system for color than we do. So we'd have different kinds of contents because of different kinds of capacities, but the stimulus would be the same. But in any case, the main point here is this: whether or not whatever that external stimulus is, what we have direct access to is this kind of mind stuff. And so then the big question is the stuff that's causing the color the same kind of stuff that you actually see, or different stuff? And the answer for the Yogacara tradition in Buddhism is, well, first, the question that's posed is, well, is it inside or outside? And eventually, this is actually a great way that Jonathan Gold glosses this, it's neither inside nor outside. That whole kind of inside-outside duality collapses. So the sort of far end of this analysis for the Dharmakirtian tradition is that essentially that duality of inside-outside is false. That we can demonstrate, they claim, they can demonstrate that the kind of stuff that you actually see when you see that color, the kind of stuff that makes up your phenomenal experience is the same kind of stuff that's making up everything else. All right, so understanding the nature of reality, therefore, in some ways is simplified by this tradition, because all you have to really do is just understand the nature of experience, since it's all the same stuff. So how do you do that? Understand the nature of experience. Well, you have to, in a sense, see it for what it is, and that might raise the question, well, then you sort of look at yourself. Right? You have a standpoint, so I have a moment of experience presented with an object like a color, but that's within my consciousness, and then I have a sense of subjectivity, like there's an over there-ness to the experience, right? I'm in here, there's over there, and that's accounted for by the structure of a sense of a subject and an object. So that sense of structure, then can we look at that structure and observe it? But of course, if we're doing that from the standpoint of consciousness itself. So now we've created a new standpoint. And of course, that new standpoint, well, that's now a subjectivity beholding an entire object, which is this, which means that in a sense, we need to get another standpoint to look at that. And now we're into an infinite regress. So this is one of the versions of the infinite regress argument that would be familiar to some of you about reflexivity. So the claim here is going to be that the only way we can know the nature of experiences itself is through something that's going to be called reflexive awareness. So let me demonstrate first kind of what that is, and then we'll go back through some more theory. One way to demonstrate that is to just ask, so let's make a timestamp here. So, and maybe even if you invite you to like gaze at the blue dot, and you'll get a prize if you can sustain attention, just like this morning, as high as possible on the blue dot. Ready? 1, 2, 3, boop. Okay, so everyone is able to see the blue dot? Great. Can I have a question for you? During the timestamp, were you sitting down? Is anyone confused about whether they were sitting down during this timestamp? Did you have to go like, well, I don't know. I wasn't looking, I was looking at the blue dots, and I was not paying attention to my body position, so I have no idea whether I was sitting down. Or is your recollection of looking at the blue dot, does it already include your body position? Did it look like the blue dot was over there? It's like, oh, what's he talking about now? Does it look like the blue dot was over there? Yes. Where's that? What? How? Is there any doubt about that? Like, oh no, I think it was over here. Your spatiotemporal location at the time of the timestamp was also part of your experience. So you're knowing your body position, you're knowing your experience. So let's give you another example. Let's suppose we go on a camping trip to eastern Tibet, and it's, we get up, it's dawn and early morning, and we walk out of the tent and take a few steps over and see this incredible sunrise, the dawn. Just amazing. It's taken by my wife, Anna Dunn. And we're seeing the beautiful sunrise. Amazing thing. Just totally absorbed in it. And then we turn around and we walk back toward the tent, and you ask me, oh, how'd you feel when you looked at the sunrise? And I go, oh, I wasn't paying attention to my feelings. I was looking at the sunrise. So let me go back, and I'll look at the sunrise, and I'll quickly look in to check how I feel. Is that how it works? Right, so at least phenomenally, it does not appear that we have a second-order cognition that is sort of knowing these things for us. it seems that our first order experience includes things like our body position, includes things like our emotional experiences, and this is what Dharmakirti would say, and those things are being included without us knowing them as an object. And the way, therefore, that they're being included is the way they're being known is they're being known through reflexive awareness. They're being presented to us without them being presented as objects. And that means that we know that stuff without them being in a dualistic structure. So that reflexive awareness is already non-dual, right? It's already non-dual. It's also, we can call it intransitive awareness. And this actually comes from the term reflexive here is trying to capture the use of a reflexive pronoun in Sanskrit. So we can say, for an example, in Spanish, I can say, yo hablo español, or you can say, se habla español. You can't really do this in English. I can say je vois ça, or I can say ça se voit in French. Can't really do it in English. I can take a transitive verb and convert it into an intransitive verb. Right? So that's the kind of knowing that's going on here, this intransitive knowing. It's the metaphor for this is luminosity or prakasha. Key aspect of this, which is already implied earlier by the model, is that subjectivity is not an agent of knowing. That subjectivity is not a knower. It's just a structural feature, because the knowing is happening just by the reflexivity itself. This is where the sort of metaphor of light comes in. Like it's if you turn on the light, everything in the room is presented. Likewise, everything in consciousness is presented just by the knowingness of consciousness itself. Finally, this is always happening. Because anytime you have an object, on this theory, you have to have a sense of subjectivity, and that subjectivity can only be presented to you non-dually by reflexive awareness. So you have non-dual reflexive awareness in every moment of experience. So if we then say, what is the nature of this experience, right? This thing to which we only have direct access, well, what is it? One way of articulating that is to say it's just that we are conscious. We are aware. We have a knowingness, or in the oral tradition they refer to it in Tibetan, hakovicha, that knowingness. And that knowingness, how are we aware that we are knowing? Well, it's exactly with that reflexivity. That sense of, if I ask you, were you aware when I made that timestamp? Does anyone doubt that they were aware? If I say boop. Right? So that sense of being aware is something that occurs just by virtue of the cognitive system itself. So I'm running out of time. I don't want to go too much longer, but I will say a couple of last things here. That part of a key feature that you heard from Willa here is the role of effort. So, and I think this is worth going through the theory of this very briefly. So basically, our systems work such that in order to survive, we attend to dangers and affordances. This is basically about salience. And conceptualizations involve modeling the self as an agent in the world. And this sense of agency involves an effort for prediction, basically. It's what conceptualization is about. That also means it involves mental time travel. It involves especially prospective projection of the self into the future, but also retrospective too. And effort for awareness, for these reasons, necessarily obscures access to non-dual awareness. Even though it's always happening, we're not aware of it because, in a sense, we're always caught in that dualistic structure. So a key feature of styles of practice is that you have to actually completely let go of effort, which makes it almost, as they say in the oral tradition, it's too easy. Like it's too easy to do the practice of really letting go and being effortless. So unfortunately, I don't really have time to go through some of these practices, but they're actually very similar to what Lama Willa talked about. And maybe at the end of the session, we can return to these kinds of practices. But this is almost identical to this is from the Chachangetung Gyatso, the Ocean of Mahāmudrā, by the 9th Karmapa. this is a very common way of referring to the kind of mindfulness that's cultivated here, which means it's just, you're not mindful of anything. This is what Mahāmudrā called asmriti, non-mindfulness. Mindfulness as mere non-distraction. And another way of talking about this that you also heard from what Lama Willa talked about is allowing the unadjusted mind to settle on its own. So these are really interesting practices that maybe we'll have time to come back to, but I went too long, so I'm going to ask Antoine Lutz now to come up and tell us about a scientific perspective on these kinds of practices. Thank you. Okay, so I'll just briefly introduce Antoine. Antoine is an old friend and collaborator.
How do you go back with that? Sorry.
Back is
Oh, yeah,
right.
right.
An old friend and collaborator, as you can see, is at INSERM in Lyon, but we spent a lot of time together in the University of Wisconsin where we were working on some of the early ADEPT studies that some of you may have heard about. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Antoine.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I'm going to try to present some of our work on which explores non-dual awareness practice from the lenses of phenomenology and cognitive neuroscience. And before I start, I just want to make one comment is that I was very interested by the contrast between the session of this morning and the session we just had, when I was really really impressed by the way they present this style of practice, when you really sense the role of experience, of the direct experience of non-duality as a central way of knowing. And I just want to say that as a scientist, it's almost a conundrum, because it's really talking about experience, and sometimes in an ineffable way, and that's almost a challenge for scientists, which are really about objects. So we can leave it for discussion, but it's an interesting question: is what type of science will be up to the able to explore non-duality? And the way I'm going to do it in this talk is in 3 steps. I will first present phenomenological taxonomy to describe non-dual awareness practices. Then I will give 2 examples of a neuroscientific study and framework that try to understand the consequences or the impact of non-duality on habit formation in the brain, and also on regulation of pain. So yeah, I'm going to start with first a little quote just to see what we're talking about. So from a text called The Flight of the Garuda. So when the watcher is not found after searching, that is a time of bringing the view to the stage of exhaustion. This view without anything to be viewed, which has no strayed into a complete void or blank nothingness, it is a present willfulness, vivid and unfabricated. This is precisely the view of the great perfection. So how it was described by John, so that's one of the claims of this tradition is that somehow this type of practices are cultivated a capacity, at least temporary, to suspend a certain very basic cognitive structure. In this case, the object-subject duality, and as John just said, that brings forward a sense of reflexive awareness or luminosity. So, as a scientist, here is a simple way, so that's a framework that John proposed a couple of years ago, to define maybe an explanandum for a scientific study of different stages of meditation. And so it's a phenomenological taxonomy of meditative stage, when you could say that a mundane perception would be a cognition when it's very object-oriented. So it's a sense of a perceived object as solid and real, and the reflexive awareness is less salient, as it was discussed by Kate before. And so gradually, through different stages of practice, you gradually let go of the grasping on the object, so what we call sometimes de-reification. And that's announced somehow the sense of subjectivity at the beginning and reflexive awareness. And gradually you can let go even further, or releasing some of the control or the focus of attention, and to arrive eventually to a state of non-duality when there is a form of suspension of the subject-object duality. So how can we scientifically explore that? So I'm going to give you a brief frameworks, and I'm going to use one of the theory on that is commonly used now in cognitive neuroscience. So there are many different theories to account for perception and action or consciousness, and I found this one useful for some of this work. So it's a framework that's called the active inference or the Bayesian brain. And it's a scientific theory, not only on perception, action, but also of metacognition. So it's quite general, and what is nice is that it somehow starts with the same framework that John described before with the Dharmakirti. So it starts by the understanding that if you look at the organism, all the brain is just in touch, is with sensory signal from the five senses. And somehow it needs to make sense of it to be able to predict the environment. So how can you account for the fact that you can from this sensory information reconstruct a perceived sense of reality with this subject-object structure? So there is not a clear theory, but the general idea that there is the main function of the brain is to develop inferences about the causal structure of the world. So you try to, from the sensory information, rediscover so try to generate a generative model. So the brain is building a model about the generative processes in the environment that are causing the sensation that it's receiving. And so it's an iterative process when gradually the brain is through the interaction with the world is updating the model based on the evidence it gave moment for moment through a general optimization principle that is called minimizing free energy. So that's the general frameworks. And if you apply that to perception, you can see that perception is cast as an organism posterior beliefs about hidden state of the world. So in this case of the blue example you just gave, so I'm French, so I'm going to use a slightly different example, but it's the same idea that you try to integrate the sensory data with prior beliefs. So if I ask you to look at these images, and let's say you need to act in the world to, for instance, find some food, and what you receive is only this sensory information, and it's noisy. Can you recognize the object? Can you raise your hand if you can do it? Okay, very good. So now if I give you a clue, like the term frog, some people can see it better? Yes? Okay, and now that's what you were supposed to see. Okay, so now this is interesting. So now you saw it, and now let's come back. Okay, and yeah, it's a French joke. Now, if you see again this picture, people who couldn't see the image, can you see the frog now? Okay, so that's really illustrate that there is a perception is an active process, which is integrating sensory information with prior knowledge, and through this gradual interaction with the world, you can develop your model. So in that case, you learn a new pattern by recognizing this picture. So now, how does it can be? So in the brain, there's a whole literature and it's a very emerging field when you can try to understand the type of algorithm or information exchange or mechanism in the brain are also following the same logic. So all the level of the brain. So the brain is organized in different within a hierarchy. And you can also understand that even within the different layers of the hierarchy, they are interacting with each other as with the same principle. So one layer is sending above, is sending prediction to the lower below, receiving prediction error, and so on. And so there is the general principle can be seen also at the hierarchical level. And so I don't have the time to go into detail, but that's a very general principle you could see implemented in the brain, for instance. And it's a way to understand its basic computation and basic functions. So what I like with this framework is that you can then understand that a certain fundamental function like attention can be understood as also a way to regulate the certain of this prior, certain of this representation. So just to give you a very simple illustration, so in green you got the likelihood, so the sensory information. In red you got the prior, the prior knowledge, and so the perception is somehow in between. And so what you can see with the shape of this distribution is how precise or how much you're going to weight either your prior knowledge or the sensory information. And to give you a very simple example, when you walk in the fog or in the dark at night, you can't really trust too much the sensory information. You need to rely on your prior. So what you see on the left, the prior is much more you give more information of weight to the prior information. But when it's in other contexts, you have to rely more on the sensory information, so gathering new information. So then you're shaping more, giving more weight to the likelihood, the sensation. And so somehow one of the role of a different mental factor like attention is to deploying precision to different layers of information in the brain. And you can understand one framework, so the different model now about meditation as a way to deploy attention to maybe shape a different prior at different layers of a different aspect of the system. So we try to test some of these ideas in a very simple case. So if you're interested, there is a recent student, Arnaud Poublo-Cozardo, who really work on this framework, and his PhD is online. And so I don't have time too much to go into detail, but one idea is that some style of practice, like the style of open monitoring or open presence or non-duality, one of the core functions will be to somehow develop a capacity to regulate priors and maybe to regulate prior formation. And that's one way very simple way to say that is maybe as perception is really driven by action. For instance, when the frog that I show is really, the goal is really to decide about perceiving the frog to act. Many of the style of practice is about a form of non-action. When you embody that in the body and the stillness of the body. And the idea is, and I can justify that later, is that it's really develop a specific mode of cognition that is facilitating change of in reshaping of certain of this prior or model. So we think that open presence or open monitoring, its function is to regulate prior formation, and but also because it's really about being very aware of what's happening, it's also have a very high precision to the sensory aspect. So we can then make different prediction about different style of meditation, how it's going to impact prior formation or sensory precision. So both of them will have a very high sensory precision, but open meditation will be able to down-regulate habits, to reduce habit formation. So we test this idea with a very simple auditory oddball paradigms, which is a very basic task when you present a regular tone, which is called standards, which is the sound like that. And sometimes there is a deviant. It is randomly presented. And this deviance is so to reflect an error. So the idea that your brain is casting predictions about the regularity of the blue sounds, and somehow the red one is creating error predictions. So you can measure the differences in the evoked potential, and that's supposed to reflect a form of error predictions about this internal model. And so we can then make a prediction that different style of meditation will impact differently this mismatch negativity. So based on the graph I presented, you could see this type of the prediction that focused attention meditation will, because of its focus, will have a. I have to go faster. So essentially, we have some evidence that somehow there is a regulation for experts, but the key prediction was really about open presence as a way to down-regulate, and there was only a trend. So it was at a trend in this effect of OP showing less mismatch negativity than FA. But the interesting things, again, here, I don't have time to go, but it's that you can see that there's clearly a difference between both styles of meditation announce perceptual silency. But OM tends to reduce, open presence tends to reduce habit formation compared to FA. So that's just an illustration about the type of experiment we can do to test different theory about different mechanism of meditation. And then I'm going to present very quickly how you can understand also a different way to understand the benefit of non-dual awareness practices is its relation to its ontological aspects. So I'm just showing a framework we developed before with Scott Nondual and Richard Davidson, when you can understand different style of meditation according to three style of meditations. And you can see that this non-dual practice can be understood as a form of deconstructive practices that are try to foster insight about the nature of perceptions and on emotion and cognitions with a way to somehow through that understanding of the nature of perception, it's supposed to facilitate or release some form of some type of suffering. So we tried specifically to test this idea to test this whole notion of the dual arrow of pain. So yes. So as you know, it's a distinction between the sensory dimension and affective dimension of pain. And we predict that this style of open presence will be particularly good at reducing the second arrow of pain and not the sensory one. And we brought in Madison some expert meditators in the lab of Richard Davidson, and we induced some thermal pain on the wrist. And as you can see, the same logic as before, we contrast two styles of meditation, one pointing attention on a visual object versus open presence meditation. And we compare novice and experts. And the core finding is that there is a better capacity to uncouple the sensory and affective the aspect of pain. With expert practitioners are less bothered by pain, but while feeling the same type of sensory experience. And we found a different correlate also in using brain imaging when there is somehow less affective anticipatory neural activity in expert versus novice, and that's changed also the way they habituate to the pain experience. And very briefly, we try to do a second round in Lyon, a second round of analysis, try to look at specifically of the mechanism of that, and we look at the impact of this style of practice on so-called pain catastrophizing. So pain catastrophizing in psychology refers to the exaggerated negative orientation toward actual anticipated pain. It involves some rumination, magnification, sense of helplessness. It has a very strong clinical implication. And so we found that they are indeed... and we designed an experiment that's really try to manipulate some of this, try to amplify the cognitive and affective aspect of pain. And so we manipulate anticipation and a long versus short pain. And you can see that indeed experts are better at uncoupling the sensory and affective aspect of pain, in particular in the long one. So, and they show less pain catastrophizing. And the key thing is that the capacity to uncouple the affective and sensory aspect of pain is driven by the self-report measure of cognitive diffusion, which is a capacity to perceive things as just mental, and that capacity seems to be a good predictor about your capacity to not to catastrophize. So we. And that's the last thing that I will leave it for the discussion. That thing that there is some finding here that maybe speak to the effortless aspect of pain, and that was so we found that there was an order effect in the way expert was experiencing pain. So if they start to do for the first block a distraction and then non-dual awareness versus non-dual awareness and then distraction, we found that the way they were experiencing the distraction was different. So if it was preceding by the non-dual awareness, there was a better capacity to uncouple, meaning that even when they don't intentionally try to regulate their experience, the fact that they were already primed by this practice really changed the way they perceive experience. Suggesting that I think in the context of what we discussed, a form of effortlessness, downregulation of pain. And I will stop here. Thank you.
folks. I'm afraid we went a little over time. But, yeah, we're all set at one table. Why not? Here we are. So, in the interest of time, we can definitely see if there are questions, comments, reactions from our group, and then also open it up pretty quickly. How's that sound? Does anyone have anything they want to ask or comment on? Say, off the top of their heads?
I'm curious what questions people have.
Okay, let's go to people. Yes, David.
Just like, in terms of John and Antoine, I'm interested to hear you guys connect what you were just talking about. It seems like there's a connection, but
Yes.
it's kind of an implicit connection, and I'd be interested to just hear you guys chat through
So I'd,
the
yeah.
framework presented and then the predictive processing for energy visualization.
So I went through the practices part really fast. Fortunately, Willa had done some of those practices before. So the idea here in the practice I presented there is what we have often called open presence. Mathieu Ricard coined that. And then there are similar practices that are not full-on open presence that sometimes would be called objects like shamatha, and those shamatha without an object, and those same instructions can be understood to be used for that purpose too. And the point of these practices is to enhance that reflexivity and to decrease that subject-object structure. In open presence, in principle, that totally disappears. But whether or not it totally disappears, experimentally what we found is that the part of what's happening here, in what Antoine was explaining, is precisely because reflexivity is the enhancing of reflexivity in meta-awareness. When you could think of reflexivity as a kind of version of meta-awareness, part of what that is doing is really downplaying the importance of priors, because it's actually inhibiting mental time travel and therefore also inhibiting at least conscious prediction. And as a result of that, we see certain types of effects, like, this idea of the second arrow. You get shot with one arrow, it hurts, but the second arrow is the way one catastrophizes the pain. And a lot of that is about anticipation, actually. So experimentally, we saw that the pain matrix would actually become active before the pain was given. There would be a signal that pain was coming, and then untrained subjects, non-meditators, would actually start to simulate pain in their brains, as it were, prior to any actual pain. And so that's precisely that's a really good example of a kind of prediction, right? Which could be important, but is definitely downregulated by open presence or even open monitoring. You want to say more, Antoine, or?
Yeah, maybe just one point that is, you could say that, why is it useful actually? Because you're supposed to be, if something is dangerous, you want to be able to defend yourself. So in this case, I think that's one point to add is that in this context, it's that they can't really control, so it doesn't make a difference whether they think too much. But what is important is that when you look at the effect across time, the different blocks, and look at region like the amygdala that is involved in particular like some fear-related processes, you can see that there's a downregulation of this amygdala activation for the experts and not the novice, meaning that there is a cost to be anticipating or too much, probably, that would be, so it's an interpretation, that would be one virtue of being able to not to add any stuff is that it's also doesn't build certain habits of like avoidance habits.
Right. So yeah. So pain catastrophizing can be actually something that is not just restricted to actual pain stimulus, but that same kind of catastrophizing can occur in other contexts too, other pathologies. So anxiety is related to catastrophizing itself.
It's highly comorbid with like depression, anxiety, and so on.
I guess on a more sort of like, let me be a little bit clearer with my question. Is the model you presented, John, for predictive processing, just in a different framing?
I would say that
that's what I want to know.
You wouldn't want to like push it all the way in that direction,
Yeah.
but it's clear that Dharmakirti explicitly says, first of all, if concepts are always dualistic because they're about modeling an agent which doesn't really exist in the way it's modeled. It's about modeling an agent, i.e. a self, acting in a world. So it's always got that dualism. Even very low-level concepts and high-level concepts, they always have that dualism. So, and they're about prediction. They're specifically goal-oriented. So that, as he says, you don't use concepts, well, he uses this very possibly not very PC metaphor, which is, a eunuch doesn't, how does he go again? A lustful woman doesn't care about eunuchs. It's a terrible metaphor, really. But his point is that when we use concepts, we are always trying to get something. So we're trying to predict specifically whether these actions are going to work. So in that sense, it's got this predictive aspect. And it's taken offline by the kind of practices that deliberately are meant to downgrade that dualistic structure. Does that make sense? So in some ways, like to say it's predictive processing would be, I think, that assumes a whole lot of stuff. But is it saying that, concept formation is predictive, inherently predictive and inherently dualistic? Yes, for sure.
But there's a limitation. I think that I see a lot of parallel to talk about the object or the content, the perception. I think in the theory about active inference, it's still... I think it's still not at the same level of granularity to talk about the subjective aspect, the reflexive aspect. I think there is something, a missing part that is not clearly articulated in the model right now. But at least to talk about the content of the mind and its regulation by attention, I can see a lot of overlap.
Can you just spell out what you're talking about a little bit more? When you said you think there's a part that's missing in the subjective experience, can you clarify?
Well, that's what John was saying. Like in his model, the Mahāmudrā's model, there is always simultaneously the sense of a subject that is placed. In the active inference, it is also there implicitly in the sense that it's this free energy minimization is supposed to reflect the point of view of the organism as a whole, as an embodied agent. So it is there in a way, but it's not as flashed out as explicitly as in the Mahāmudrā, in a phenomenological sense. So I still think that there is, you can see that in principle, it's possible because this framework is, what is good is taking the viewpoint of the organism, okay? So there is a similarity, but I think it's a little bit over interpreting the modeling to say that it's similar to the phenomenological experience of reflexivity. Makes sense? So there's still work to do, where we develop a model of meta-awareness, for instance, and that's try to go in that direction, but it's still at least me, I'm still not clear the connection with reflexivity as such.
Or even meta-awareness in some ways, right? If we think of reflexivity as a specific kind of version of meta-awareness, exactly what role that plays in predictive processing, especially at a conscious level or phenomenal level, I think is not that clear.
Wouldn't it just be modeling yourself as an actor to predict what happens?
Well, that would be one, but here the point, and this is a key point of like reflexivity is required for modeling a sense of subjectivity and body position and spatio-temporal location, and it may even be possible to break it into more primitive versions of what we're talking about. But if you have a sense of subjectivity, etc., you have reflexivity on this model. If you have reflexivity, you don't necessarily have a sense of subjectivity. So it's not inherently tied to the modeling of self. And that's, I think, something that is really key that that way of thinking about meta-awareness, I think, I don't know how to fit that into a predictive model, predictive coding model. There's a question in the back, and there was a question.
Oh, okay, cool. So I had a question. Though actually, I think it tied to both parts of the session. But in Weila's talk about Longchenpa, something that stood out to me, and then also in the question about Vipassana after, is that there's a lot of descriptions of people who get really good at the non-dual awareness or like open monitoring who are also at the same time practicing the sort of focus, the kind of focused attention meditation that we were describing in the first session. And so I wanted to just say something about how, like, just note that on the face of it, that should sound weird to you, right? It's like if someone, I think, so let me tell you, so here's somewhat, I don't think it is weird, but I think that there is a way to tie the two sessions together, but in a way, it's like if somebody were like, oh, I'm gonna train to run a marathon, and then like, but my strategy is to like lie down in bed. Like, you're saying that I'm gonna train to have open monitoring meditation to be able to like let my mind wander basically for long periods of time. And my strategy to be able to do that is to learn how to get really good on focusing on one thing, right? And so I wanted to bring this up to tie the two sessions together because, I mean, Sonam and I think part of the way that we originally started thinking about all this stuff is thinking that like one explanation for why it would help to have the one kind of practice is that both of them involve, there are these like basic metacognitive signals like effort and boredom that make your mind constantly move between not only different contents, but also different modes of experiencing the world, right? Things like mind wandering and things like focused attention, things like salience-driven attention. And what you would be good at doing in both things, that's a common factor, is taking those metacognitive feelings and, you know, downregulating how much they influence your shifting between different modes of attention. And I think if we don't have that kind of model, I wonder what kind of explanation we can give of the overlap between very different things.
So just to be clear, if there had been time, and I'm not sure, but I think I had to step out, but so in Mahāmudrā, unlike generally in Dzokchen, you actually very explicitly do a training where you've taken an object, often a visual object actually, but also the breath can be used. But they say it's not the mikpa. It is not the alambana. It's not actually the object. You're not meditating on that object. You're using it as what they call a jeto, which means a reminder. And essentially because the idea here is you actually don't want to, what would be weird is if you practice jhana and Mahāmudrā. That would be weird. Because you're not actually trying to absorb yourself in full focus on the object. You're using the object as a means to, first of all, cultivate a kind of meta-awareness, really reflexivity, that enables you. So you're doing mindfulness, and then that style of mindfulness in the beginning involves placing attention on an object. And then, of course, as distractions arise, you're learning how not to get caught by the distraction. You don't have to stop the thoughts. You just don't get caught. You don't get on the train, as it were, right? And then gradually, you actually kind of like, one metaphor I've heard is, you know, it's like your hands on a buoy in the water, and you kind of gradually let go, and now you don't have any objects. So you start with like the breath, and then you gradually kind of let go of any object, but you're still in the same state of being undistracted. So that's called svasaṃvitti, the mindfulness of mere non-distraction. It's mere because you don't have an object, but you're not distracted. So that's the same about that. The kind of mindfulness there's no attention capture, right? So thoughts or whatever happening, they're not capturing your attention. But now what's different is that you've cultivated that initially because it's easier for stability when you have an object, and then you gradually let go of the object. So that's, I think, to my mind, that's the real continuity between those kinds of practices and this kind of practice, which is that you basically are learning how to cultivate that specific aspect of mindfulness, which is where it's described in classical Abhidharma texts as having the function of preventing distraction. So you can be undistracted and not on an object, because you're not experiencing attention capture, and you're not unconscious, obviously. So that's called objectless mindfulness or objectless shamatha. So to my mind, that's the kind of continuity there.
Should be the level 3.
Yeah, it'd be like level 3 in that chart, yeah.
I think one of the other things that's super important to keep in mind is that both of these practices are playing around with the cultivation of immersion and pliancy. And one of the things that becomes really important, I think, when you're playing around with non-dual practices is getting into a space where your mind is pliable enough that you can let go. And in the same way, when you're playing around with Vipassana practices, what you need to do is you need to get your mind into a pliable and immersive enough state that you can stay attentive to the flow of whatever the experiences are. And it seems to me that that's, if we're thinking in generative terms, one of the really key points that is going to be shared across these two kinds of practices is being able to get into that immersive and also at the same time pliant space, which frames your discussion earlier a little bit differently, but yep.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Hello, thank you again for your presentation today. My question, I think Zach kind of asked it in a way, which was, I was interested in the categories where they're used in psychological studies, like focused attention, open monitoring, open presence. I was going to ask about the utility of those. I think you've already spoken to those as far as what they're able to kind of identify. I guess if you have any follow-up on, I think you mentioned that Mathieu Ricard had developed the open presence practice. I'm wondering if, like, is that the list? Is that inclusive of developing kind of categories that cut across different religious traditions in order to study similar phenomenological experiences? I'm wondering if you can speak to that. Another one would be to follow up on this idea of reducing affect and being able to downregulate emotion. I'm wondering if, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this idea of compassion collapse and the idea that people who are better able to downregulate negative emotions are also those who are less inclined to help because they're able to downregulate the negative emotions that are experienced when identifying somebody who's suffering or something like that. And if you've thought about how the research you're doing relates to altruistic behavior.
Altruistic behavior. Well, Antoine and I actually developed the FAOM distinction in an article we wrote with Helene Slachter and Richie Davidson and anybody else. That was it, in Ticks, and which has now been cited like 2,500 times or something crazy like that. So obviously people liked that because before that,
it was opening up, right?
it was just meditation.
But didn't Claudio Naranjo also have opening up?
Oh, maybe.
And concentration as two categories, and they seem related.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, the landscape was kind of bleak. And so it was an advancement. But at the time, we tried to acknowledge at the time, and actually Mathieu got a little mad at us for open monitoring, Mathieu Ricard, because it was like, it's not monitoring, that's too dualistic. But we were trying to capture a wider range of practices across multiple traditions that involved this kind of enhanced meta-awareness and maybe a light touch on objects, but not really, the goal was not focus on objects. And focused attention, in contrast, was something that was much more about, still involved meta-awareness, because you have to have that for cognitive control, but that was much more about, object-oriented focus and could then encompass the jhana practices. So it's definitely not enough, but it was probably a good start, I would say. I'd say on the second thing, real quick, and then see what Antoine has to say. One of the things that's interesting about Mahayana practices, right, where Mahayana compassion becomes a much more explicit part of practices, is that those then end up being, compassion is really, really important in the non-dual traditions. It's important in all Mahayana traditions, but certainly in the Indo-Tibetan non-dual traditions, it's extremely important. So, and actually there are practices in, I think you cited Shabkar, there are practices that very explicitly involve evoking very intense emotional states and not trying to down-regulate them, but actually to use the intensity of the emotional state as a basis, because then when that emotional state's really intense, right, just like looking at the beautiful sunrise, when the emotional state's really intense, that reflexivity is more active, because it's doing its job of presenting that cognitive background. So actually emotions, it's a little problematic to think of this as these styles, which are closely related to Tantra, where the same thing happens, they're not really about down-regulating emotions. It's more complicated than that, I'd say.
And so just to complement what John said, to the first taxonomy, it's really about trying to look at structural environment of consciousness. So it's a phenomenological formulation of invariant. And so the most basic one, which is really on the subject-object intentionality and reflexivity, and that's very similar to what you see in continental phenomenology, for instance. Now, the connection with let's say altruism is it's as you know, it's present also. Like when you do one-point attention, you can do all the meta practice that is done. For instance, the Vipassana tradition, it's also a focused attention meditation, if you want. And so we present another taxonomy that I briefly flashed out with this typology of meditation that is supposed to more capture the specific role of different family of meditation. And so if you want, the compassion family in that sense could be understood as a training to change maladaptive self schema and to be more other-oriented and less self-centered. And so all that to say that there serve different purposes, this taxonomy, depending on what is your question. If you and so in the context of altruism, maybe the typology of attentional, constructive, deconstructive is more helpful. If you are interested in more the structural feature of consciousness, and then the other typology is useful. And yeah, that's, I know I'm sure a lot to unpack, but that's for some comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious about, we're talking about the preconditions for open awareness, non-meditative experiences, set and setting. And I'm just thinking about direct experience, kind of in like a Dzogchen practice or retreat, where a lot of time is spent preparing for the recognition of the nature of mind. And so I'm curious about, as you're thinking about set and setting, you're thinking about non-meditative experiences, is there direct inquiry that you guys have in terms of setting up the conditions on a conceptual level for the nature of mind? And is that fundamentally impactful for whether or not those non-meditative experiences are happening, how they're happening, or is that part of kind of the set and setting?
The last part of the question I didn't quite get. Could you?
Yeah, basically, what's the role of recognition of the nature of the mind in a conceptual way on kind of the actual non-meditative experience?
On the non-meditative experience? I mean, like, what impact does that have? I guess it makes you a Buddha, isn't that what they say? But so one way of thinking about this is that what it means to have recognition in a technical Dharmakirtian model, what it means to have recognition of the nature of the mind is that you are the kind of non-dual awareness that is occurring is able to create a subsequent conceptualization of the non-dual experience. And so the idea theoretically is that people go through this all the time for various reasons, like when they fall asleep, or when they're waking up, but when they pass through these kinds of states, they totally don't know that they are. So they're not, in a sense, adequately prepared for that recognition. There's a lot of issues around how the recognition can occur, like because language is dualistic, can you really help people to see it if you use language, right? Or even if you use symbols and so on, because those are all going to be dualistic. So there are issues around how you actually get people to recognize. But then one of the main outcomes in principle of a recognition, and there are other people here who can talk about this too, but one of the main outcomes in principle of that kind of a recognition would be that you have a sense of the contingency of your own subjectivity. Like you don't really identify with your subjectivity in the same way anymore. So that, which presumably has behavioral outcomes like, for example, classic one is if someone insults you, it's like, whatever.
Insult who?
Insult who? No, but so, yeah. So that there it doesn't mean you become dysfunctional. It's just that, these kind of automatic reactions around identifying with a certain kind of subjectivity, they begin to subside, allegedly.
John, can I make a comment? Oh, sorry, Villa.
Oh, there's Willa. Oh, yeah. doggy care. I didn't know you were there.
I could fetch a dog and go and see.
Oh, she's so sweet.
I just think your question brings up something really important, which is that there's non-meditation, and then there's this recognition of the nature of mind. Non-meditation really sounds like a non-doing, right? And then recognition of something is a kind of a doing, right? I mean, there's a bit of a, something's happening there, right? Something's happening. And I just think this is a really critical tension in these non-dual discourses and in the non-dual practices, which is the tension between doing and non-doing. Because even though theorists like we heard Longchenpa, like it's not about doing, it's effortless and so forth, actually, there's quite a bit of little doings in the non-doing, right? Like even the setup of the set and the setting, or this idea that there is a recognition. So I think that in practice too, in practice even as it's described, you know, in these Namtar and these sort of first-person accounts, and maybe in our own first-person experience, that tension is there. So, and also just, you know, just to, you know, big nod to this morning too, like all of those practices are held in the canons of these in which these non-dual traditions are practicing, right? They're holding the canons, the early Buddhist canons that are all about that focus and effort and the jhanas. It's not like those aren't part of the training at all. They're kind of in the background as part of the setting. So I just wanted to name that what you brought up brings up this really interesting, you know, this interesting tension between doing and non-doing. It's a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
Andrew had a thing.
I think that's really spot on. Well, and super important. It's really about Dharma, DHR, to hold. So in a certain way, you're creating a holding environment here, right? So the effort is in creating the mandala, the essence container. So in a certain way, when the mandala is created and then you step into that, preliminary is more important than the main practice, classic tantric maxim, then the fundamental result is one, openness and relaxation. And so therefore, you can have this dialethic kind of approach. You can actually have both. So you create the container with the effort so that when you step into that particular holding environment, then the natural response is openness and relaxation. So I think that's how they fit.
Yeah, I wanted just to make a little comment from the science part, that I was always very impressed by all the practitioners who came to the lab. The first question is always, how is it going to be useful? And whenever there was in the scanner, there was always setting in attention, some visualization, visualization of the lineage and so on. So there was some always preparation before the action, doing the practice, which made me think that now, since we start to do the research, I mean, what I noticed is that at the beginning there was a strong emphasis on attention, then mindfulness. Now it's talking about more compassion, loving kindness, and more I see the notion of non-dual awareness arriving and being more popular. And I'm within the scientific community and clinical research, and I just hope that there will be that the setting is not going to be lost in these studies. So it's going to be a big challenge, I think.
Yeah, I think we're close to time. So I just want to raise this question, maybe to draw something out so it doesn't get lost in future conversations tomorrow and over the next few days, which is going back to Bryce's manatee and crocodile teachers. The conversation tends to move towards cognition and attention and our consciousness. So I wanted to go back to this question of an ecological non-duality, and just to highlight that, to see if there's a shared theme actually running throughout all or maybe most of the presentations. So where I thought you were going to go with the story of the crocodile was a much more kind of visceral sense of ecological non-duality, that Plumwood's body, potentially being eaten and digested by an ecosystem, which is a kind of effortless non-duality. Takes no particular skill either, but in a way, materially, ecologically, we are all embedded in that web that Bryce, you put up there. And that feature, that materiality of non-duality actually is present in some of the other presentations as well. You could hear it in Willa's evocation of the setting and the crows and the sky in this cave. There's some kind of ecological context, or maybe, as Andrew was just saying, a holding space perhaps. But my question is whether that is pointing, that possibility of an ecological context is actually pointing to what like someone like Merleau-Ponty would talk about as a primordial context. And when we evoke phenomenology, we often do it just in terms of cognition, but phenomenology, certainly the way Husserl and Merleau-Ponty took it, was actually pointing at this embodied kind of primordial context or life world, or flesh, from Merleau-Ponty. And I thought you were going to kind of go in that direction, and I think my question is there, in all of these examples of non-duality, are we pointing back to something pre-theoretical, pre-cognitive, pre-dualistic, before there's a subject and object split? And that was really obvious in Kat's presentation of a kind of monistic Shiva, or some kind of monism before the split. And you could see that with a manatee, you could see that with a crocodile, right? The manatee is in a kind of primordial non-duality, not just because it's floating in the ocean, but that its very flesh evolved in response to its oceanic and aquatic environment, right? And that eyeballs perceive blue in part because the rods and cones of the eyeball have evolved over time in response to light waves. That's a material non-dual relation between the perceiving organism and the environment that is a loop, it's non-dual. So my question here, what I'm trying to draw out is there's some kind of material ecological non-duality. I don't want to lose that thread. And the second my question is there all of these traditions pointing something that happens before a split, before the subject and object?
So great comment. I'd like to take the second point first, the one about the before. It's really important for these Shaivas that Shiva is not before the world. And the reason why that's important is because time is something that emerges out of consciousness itself, and that actually is part of what gives rise to subject-object structure. So time is actually the expression of the inherent non-dual differentiation of consciousness itself. So it's not like there's a primordial non-duality and then it splits off into these dualistic worlds, and then the worlds are go forward in some kind of causal way. Rather, it's that every single moment just is the purple showing up as red and blue, but it's never, something that's temporally prior to or other than the worlds that it's creating. It is beyond in the sense that Shiva is more than any one world, but that's very different than being like prior to or primordial or something along those lines. And I think that has important implications because there are all kinds of critiques of origins that the Shaivas would fall into if they were making a claim about like sort of an originary force then creating a world out of itself.
No? You don't want to touch that one?
What do you want me to say?
Well, so in Dzogchen, in some Dzogchen cosmologies, there is this idea of like that the primordial purity, that the Kadak, Shi Kuntuzampo was just, there was a time before. But mostly, and then especially in Mahāmudrā, you don't see that so much. mostly is this idea that, it's really similar to what Kat was saying, that when we're talking about this sort of non-dual nature of the mind, we're already in the do, make it do. We're in the fourth time, not past, present, future. We're in the timeless time. So like asking the question of before doesn't even make any sense. And of course, in another way, actually, it's never, none of it, the whole duality thing is just an illusion. So it's like you've never been parted from your own non-dual primordial awareness. So like, what's before? That's incredibly unhelpful, I know, I'm sorry. But I do want to say real quick, and go, because I want to hear what you have to say. Yeah, I was going to say something about that.
One thing that I'm absolutely always unsure what to think about is the move to saying that what all this is, in some sense, is consciousness. And I think part of the reason I'm unsure what to say about that is that by the time we've moved to the massively interdependent, whatever it is, it's unclear how that relates to the thing that we typically talk about as conscious. And when we're talking about what is, in some sense, primordial, not necessarily temporally, but what this is, whatever this is, I think there's, what we see is a couple of different ways of trying to thematize that and to make sense of it. And all of that is concept-laden. All of that is anchored to a history of intelligibility and sense-making. All of it is shaped by the ways that we're trying to embed that in larger theoretical frameworks. And if you come at it like somebody like Val Plumwood, what you see is that world where we live each other's death and die each other's life because of the way that those cycles operate. That's something that's deeply, deeply material, but not material in the way that we typically think about the materiality of chairs and tables. It's material in the way that all of the interconnected structure in the world is continually calling into existence differentiation and tearing down differentiation. And that's, I think, a different way of telling the story than what you get if you're a Shaiva. It overlaps in interesting ways, but it feels at least like the orienting and the ontologizing takes on a different form because of the way that it gets narrativized and because of the way that the story gets told.
So I'm going to agree with the last part of that, but then say something that undoes my agreement a little bit. So consciousness is probably not the right word here. Maybe something like awareness, which might be a little more neutral, is a little better. But you could also do materiality if you have a certain kind of understanding of matter. The reason why I've been playing around a lot with that purple metaphor is that if you think about the metaphor, neither the red nor the blue are more fundamentally constitutive of purple than the other. In the exact same way, neither subject nor object is closer to consciousness than the other is for these Shaivas. This is not a reduction to subjectivity. It's not leaving objects behind. Abhinav actually has a number of wonderful, gorgeous verses where he talks about how like the highest accomplishment that Shiva undertakes is presenting as a rock, because that's the ability for consciousness to present itself as precisely what it's not, as its exact opposite. And that also, though, is why they push in the direction of some kind of awareness-y type thing, because awarenesses have the capacity to imagine. And it's that fundamentally capacity for imagination, for hiding, for presenting as what it's not, that's so important for the Shaivas.
That's great. And we should probably stop. I'll just say briefly, I also don't think consciousness is really the best word. It's definitely also not in Yogacara, and as I read Dharmakirti, not a collapse into some kind of, subjective idealism. But then the way I like to use that word stuff, because it's kind of like questioning, what is it? Just what is it? And questioning the dualism, in this case, the kind of materiality and immateriality. And where Tantra goes, at least some Tantra goes in the end in Buddhism, and probably Shaivism too, I don't really know this, is it's all what they call vayu, which is, or lung in Tibetan, like wind, energy, breath, whatever you want to translate that. So anyway, but I totally like the different kinds of narratives and stuff is such a great point, like where we're starting from, what our priors are. So I'm afraid, I think, David, we unfortunately, because I'm sure people are getting tired, or anyway, I am, and so I think we should probably call it quits for today. Thank you very much for your attention.